Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Is air travel as safe as it used to be? Since just the beginning of January, there have been 4 major airplane crashes in North America. In 3 out of 4 of those crashes, people were killed. Thankfully, Monday's crash at Pearson Airport in Toronto was not fatal. But how did a routine landing in windy weather end up with a Delta Airlines flight sitting upside down on the runway? What will the investigators want to know? And should we be worried about our safety when we strap in for a commercial flight? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with John Gradek, aviation expert with McGill University. Hi, John. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, David. It's a pleasure.
So, lately we've seen a lot of news headlines about plane crashes and air travel safety and all the problems with the Boeing 737 MAX 8 plane a few years ago. More recently, the Alaska Airlines flight that had the door blow out midair. The Jeju Airlines crash tragically killed all the passengers on board, those in South Korea. The mid-air collision in Washington, D.C. last month, another tragedy. Now we have this incident at Pearson where thankfully nobody lost their lives. But John, are we seeing more plane crashes recently than usual, or does it maybe just feel that way?
We've seen more. We've seen more crashes, and there's no doubt about it that there is a concern about flight safety, which I would have normally said not to worry. It's not. It's an aberration. But I think that what we've seen happen over the last 4 or 5 years, there is a kind of a question mark given on the effectiveness of our aviation system from a safety, security, operations handling, operations management perspective that, should not, affect safety and security and a feeling that you should be comfortable on board an airplane. But human nature being human nature, when you hear these incidents and accidents and these deaths, you always ask yourself the question, would I be next? And the cold hard facts about aviation are that it is the safest mode of transportation, bar none, on the planet. And the number of people the fatalities that we have in any one given year. Compare that to the number of passengers that are flying every year, and the number of airplanes that are out there, the number of people that are killed in terms of overall traffic flown is infinitesimal. We may have 200 or 300 people killed in a given year on aircraft accidents, but it pales in comparison to the tens of millions of people that fly very successfully in the aviation world. So yes, the headlines are there. Yes, people have gotten killed in aviation accidents. The number of aviation accidents is still low. And what we saw in the last 4 or 5 weeks are just statistical aberrations as far as I'm concerned, that, the law of averages catches up to you. And it's like going to Vegas and hitting the jackpot 3 times in a row. If you hit it twice in a row, are you gonna hit it a third time? Probably not. But that it's like flying. Flying is not risk-free. Flying is sometimes you get an incident. The probability of that incident happening is very low, but when it does happen, it does make headlines.
Okay, so if we're seeing more crashes, it's not necessarily because things have become drastically less safe recently. It's more a function of, as you say, averages, more people flying in the skies. Is that right? Okay, so this incident at Pearson on Monday, how the heck does that happen? John, a plane on its roof, I can't remember having ever seen that before, me personally. How unusual was that?
It was very unusual. It was very unusual. Usually, these types of crashes, unfortunately, end up with a total loss of structure and total fatalities. And we saw that happen earlier this year in the Jeju flight crash in South Korea. That whenever you have a botched landing, it does have a bad ending. In this one, a botched landing for whatever reason, we don't know that. We'll let the TSP figure that one out. But a botched landing, and everybody walked away. And I think that is, a kudos are to be given to the flight crew, the flight attendants, the pilots who got us airplane down the runway, and the flight attendants who made sure everybody's belts were fastened before the plane landed. That saved dozens of lives on the airplane yesterday. Manufacturers built a plane that could withstand all of that stuff that it was going through as it was barreling down the runway, and that fuselage stayed intact. Did not break apart, did not split, did not do anything. That fuselage stayed intact during all of that tumultuous ride down the runway, and the fires and breaking off of wings and everything else, and that allowed the passengers and crew to basically come off of that airplane unscathed.
Yeah, so this was a Canadian-made plane, a Mitsubishi CRJ 900 built by Bombardier, had about 16 years of service on that aircraft. But as you say, it's a pretty sturdy plane. Nobody was seriously hurt. The thing did not completely fall apart. So I guess people can take some comfort in that. John, does that speak to, is that emblematic of the advances that have been made with airplane safety and with manufacturing, the fact that it held up even after it flipped over?
Yeah, I think we've seen examples of that over the last few years when you've had crashes and we've had fires in airplanes and we've had people evacuate from airplanes, and we've had, I think it was an incident last year where we had an Airbus aircraft that had a fire in one of the engines, and everybody got evacuated within the space of 90 seconds. I think Japan Airlines had one of those crashes as well, where it struck a Coast Guard airplane on takeoff, and the plane didn't rotate and ended up with some fires, and the flight attendants took 90 seconds to get everybody off, all 300 people, and the airplane fuselage held for all of that. So we're getting to have what I would call much more resilient aircraft being built. They're very robust, even though they're built with composites. They're not built with steel anymore or aluminum. Those composites go through a very rigorous flame test, go through stress tests. When these airplanes are designed and manufactured, those airplanes have gone through some pretty amazing stress tests in terms of making sure the airplane has got a specification that allows it to go through some pretty nasty events, and they're able to in fact deliver the value to that airplane. So there's a lot of things going on with that airplane that makes a lot of sense.
So what will the investigators be looking at when they are studying this crash site?
Yeah, I think that what they're going to be looking for are anomalies in the standard practices that these guys typically use to land an airplane. They're going to be looking for situations where the conversation with air traffic control to clear them for landing, or weather updates, or information about previous landings. They're going to look at that conversation, the acknowledgement of that conversation about a flight crew. They're going to be looking at how did they prepare the various systems on board the airplane for landing. Things like landing lights, landing gear, flaps, all of those things that are normal processes for crews to prepare an aircraft for landing. They're going to be looking for weather information that they have on board the airplane that allows them to see any thing outside of the ordinary when it comes to either winds or precipitation. So there's a checklist of things that the inspectors will be looking at that were directly related to the cockpit of the airplane and how well the cockpit was prepared for landing. They're going to be looking at the mechanical systems on board the airplane to ensure that the mechanical systems that were in place, whether they're landing gear or actuators or flaps or whatever piece of equipment that were on board that airplane, whether they were in, in working condition, what was a maintenance history of those condition of those pieces of equipment? Was there a history of malfunction for any of these pieces of equipment? They'll be talking to air traffic control, interviewing the air traffic controllers that were on duty that night or that afternoon, yesterday afternoon, both ground as well as air traffic control. They'll be talking to the fire crews that were deployed to the aircraft. They'll be talking to of course, the pilots, the flight attendants, and passengers. So they've got and they're going to be looking at the black boxes. The black boxes are the pieces of information that is gathered by the aircraft through its systems, whether it's voice or whether it's data feeds. That's going to be validating the conversations that TSB will have with the crew, and it will also validate the settings, the various settings on board the airplane to prepare the airplane for a smooth landing.
This case, unlike some other recent crashes, they should have no problem recovering that black box. Is there a normal range of time that analyzing that data will take?
No, they've got they've got to get those boxes. Usually, the boxes are located in the tail of the aircraft. So yeah, they should be pretty close at hand. I don't think the tail was. Hopefully, I don't think the tail was that badly damaged so that the boxes were not readable. But those boxes are built to withstand a lot of G-force on it, and I'm pretty sure that the boxes are in good shape. There's some transcribing that has to take. Those boxes have to be cleaned up and data has to be extracted. So that's a few days worth of work. Then you've got to kind of come to some conclusions. Given all that data, what are you concluding as investigators? So you'll have the TSB there. You'll have the U.S. NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. You might have people from the FAA there as well, who are there to make sure that the regulatory side of the aircraft. This is a U.S. registered airplane, and it had to follow U.S. rules, and it was an aircraft that had to be monitored and managed by U.S. regulators. So the U.S. has a very interesting role to play in this one. Canadian TSB is there because the airplane crash happened in Canada. There were Canadians on board the airplane, so there's some very specific roles that organizations will be playing in trying to gather the data and then synthesize the data and then come to some conclusions. And we should be getting a report back from the TSB. My view is probably within 30 days. You'll get a report back saying this is our preliminary investigation and these are the conclusions we're coming to. And please stand by. We'll give you a more detailed report, and that comes out usually in about a year.
When it comes to the origin of the airplane and the crew, whether it's a Canadian airline or American from Europe or Asia or wherever, is there much of a difference in the safety standards and the protocols across the world, or are they all have to meet some sort of minimum requirement? How does that work?
Good question. The countries in which these airplanes fly have to provide permission for those airplanes to fly in that airspace. So if this airplane was a Delta airplane, CRJ 900, there are regulations in terms of what should the maintenance practices be like on this airplane, and the U.S. authorities in this case had to certify to the Canadian authorities that this airplane has satisfied all of the licensing agreements, all of the mechanical agreements, all of the operational agreements that the FAA has, and that Canada could trust the FAA for doing the work, making sure this airplane was properly licensed. But each country has its own licensing practices. Each country has its own rules, its own regulations. So there is some differences between the state of repair of an airplane that is registered in Canada versus the state of repair of an airplane that's registered, let's just say, in South Sudan. Would you want to fly an airplane out of South Sudan? Well, if you have a high tolerance for risk, yeah. But the Europeans have banned, airlines that have these shady maintenance records from flying in European airspace. So the South Sudan airplane is not allowed to fly into Europe. So it's only allowed to fly in areas where other jurisdictions have permitted South Sudan standards to be acceptable. Very few countries have done that. So, like I said, the ICAO has standards. There are standards that are manufacturer standards. There are regulatory standards. So there's a lot of regulation in terms of what conditions should those airplanes be in when they're flying over your country, into your country, carrying your citizens in that airplane.
Okay, so to tie a bow on it for today, John, generally speaking, is air travel more or less safe today than it was, say, 30 years ago?
No, it's safer. It's safer today. We've come a long way in airplane manufacture. The airplane manufacturer and the testing that goes into the design of airplanes is much more rigorous today. It's much more, you're putting a lot more stress on the aircraft in the testing phase, in the design phase of that airplane than you have at any time in the past on these airplanes. So you'll see these guys bend wings, to 70 or 80 degrees. Not that happens every day, but you want to make sure that when the event that does happen, the wing will not snap. So, and they do the same thing with the fuselages. They puncture it, and they see how much, pressure is going to be required to puncture the fuselage. So there's a myriad, hundreds of tests that really put the airplane through as much stress as they think is feasible, and they go beyond what would normally be acceptable for stress on this airplane. So airplanes are built to handle, significant stress much more than they have been in the past. And the same thing with crews. The flight crews, the flight attendants, they're all trained to a higher standard these days. They're much more concerned about things like, cybersecurity. They're more concerned about people in, customer service interaction. They're more concerned about, the avionics, the GPSs, the AI, the cell phones, the tablets. Those are all things that have happened in the world around us that impact on aviation. And flight attendants and pilots have to know how to deal with that. So there's a lot more training going on. There's a lot more technology in the airports, more technology on board the airplanes. If you remember, a captain or a flight or a co-pilot used to go on board airplanes, and they used to carry these briefcases upon briefcases of route charts and route maps and everything else, so that they can, as they're flying around the world or flying to some far away country, they have all of the physical route maps with them. Not anymore. It's all on a tablet. And that tablet contains more information than those briefcases ever had. So there's a lot of technology. There's a lot of advancement that have been made, both in terms of design as well as in operation of today's airplanes. And, all to the better. The trust level, has gone up. The incidents, while they are headline grabbing, have come down in respect to the percentage of population that are flying. People trust the airline industry. People trust regulators. And we're seeing that benefit throughout our history these days.
Okay. John Gradek, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to have you as our guest on the show. Thank you again.
My pleasure, David. And look forward to doing this again whenever you have a chance.
And again, that was John Gradek, aviation expert with McGill University. And that was the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast platforms. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. Until next time, I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.